Hi everyone, this is the video for the readings for the Politics Affirmative number 1 readings, and we'll go through the main arguments here, and then we will talk a little bit about rebuttals. First of all, this is what we can call the public sphere advantage. This is from the Shirky reading mostly. And in order to understand this reading, I think it's important to understand what the public sphere is. It was a concept by a theorist named Jürgen Habermas, who said that democracy arose in like the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, as well as somewhat in the U.S., as people started coming together in places like coffee shops and bars and salons and clubs and discussing political issues. As they, at the time, you got to remember that these were monarchies, and the people were, for the first time getting the news media because of the printing press and books and stuff, and they were reading this stuff, and they were coming together, say, at the coffee shop and talking about politics, much like we might today. And eventually, Habermas says that that discussion led themselves to see themselves as the public, and as the public make demands on the monarchy, etc. And those demands eventually led to democracy itself. So the public sphere is just basically those places where we engage in political discussion and discourse. And obviously we do that a lot online these days. So the internet is an expansion, or social media is an expansion of the public sphere. And that discussion is key to democracy in a couple of ways. One is it allowed the public to monitor what the government was doing and discuss it and be more aware of what was going on. So it served as like a means of accountability for governments, a sort of check on governments, and also a way for the public to understand itself as having shared demands, shared concerns, and make demands on the government. And so, the public sphere itself, as Shirky mentions, is very key to democratic reform. So, how do digital media promote the public sphere? Obviously, social media, etc., it promotes political discussion, right? There's a lot more political discussion that goes on because of the internet and stuff. And it's an important distinction that Shirky makes between the instrumental view of social media and the internet versus the environmental view. The instrumental view would be like the idea that it's a tool for democracy, or it's a tool for activism, right? Like you remember the Arab Spring or the Occupy Wall Street, and how they used social media to organize and make demands. So that sees social media as a tool. And Shirky says that sort of like this instrumental view, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the tool is effective and sometimes it isn't, right? Like Arab Spring didn't really end up leading to a lot of democracy. Occupy didn't really get its demands met very well. But Shirky says that, you can, sometimes it's a success, sometimes it's a failure when you look at it as a tool, but when you look at it as creating a new environment, that social media is particularly important. That is that now we have these environs, these areas where political discourse takes place. And by changing that environment, by giving us more areas to engage in political discourse, by making it more common and expected that people engage in political discourse, that in the long run, these media will promote democracy. And a big part of that, according to Shirky, is the two-step process. He says that there's a famous study by Katz and Lazarsfeld that said that most political influence happens in a two-step way. The leaders of political parties, etc., the media, disseminate information, and then those members of your leaders and members of your community, your friends and families, your pastors, etc., then communicate those ideas to everyone else, right? And Katz and Lazarsfeld said that political that second step is really important, right? That people become more aware and more engaged politically when their community leaders are presenting them with information And so digital media help this second step process, right? It makes us more connected to our community leaders, and it makes it more likely that our community leaders will be kind of disseminating that political information. As well, this new environment for political discussion and political discourse creates norms for free speech and the free press, right? We expect that we'll be able to discuss politics online, so we have these new norms. And when the government tries to crack down on the press, people are more aware of it and more against it and stuff. I think this sort of explains some of the backlash against the idea that like Twitter and Facebook are censoring certain voices, as we expect social media to be a place of free speech and free discourse, and so people are upset when it's not always that way. Now, Shirky's making the argument that this works especially in authoritarian governments, places where there isn't democracy right now. So you can imagine, like say in China, where people are afraid to talk about political discourse or politics because of the government maybe locking them up or whatever. That when you get online, it's harder for governments to track you, and it's harder for governments to crack down on that speech, and so it becomes much more normal and common for people to engage in political speech because of the new public sphere. Shirky also talks about how it's hard to censor social media and stuff because since the internet is not only used for politics but also used for entertaining things, TV shows and what he calls like the cute cat theory, like pictures of cute cats and stuff, that when the government tries to censor them, there's a bigger backlash than there would be when they try to block things that are just political, right? So if the government tries to ban Facebook or something like that, because there's a lot of people who use Facebook for cute cat pictures, people get more mad, and therefore it's harder to do that. It's harder for these authoritarian governments to crack down on it. There's also a lot of interesting rebuttal type arguments in the Shirky piece that I think you should take, should pay attention to, because we're going to read a lot of the arguments that he answers in this article as well. He answers the argument that mostly the internet and social media are used for distraction and entertainment. And he says that, yeah, all media are mostly used for distraction and entertainment, but that doesn't mean that these media aren't also expanding political information and political discussion. He answers the argument, which we'll also read, that repressive governments can use social media and internet and digital tools to crack down on dissidents and activists. And he says actually their response, the fact that they try to crack down on it so hard, proves that these tools actually work for transparency and democracy, right? The fact that repressive governments are so afraid of these tools proves that on balance they're better for democracy. We'll also read some articles on what's called slacktivism. Slacktivism is the idea that internet activism is just clicking buttons and not really the type of committed activism you need to get social change. And he says, yeah, sure, that happens some again, but they can also be used by strong activists, right? Not everyone who's an activist online only clicks like and retweets and stuff. And they can coordinate their activities better, they can raise funds better, etc. Due to this. The Schmidt and Cohen reading, which is the second reading, kind of has two advantages here, but I'm going to save the second one for the next set of readings because those are kind of focused on the same issue. That second advantage is like an activism advantage, the idea that social media help activists and promote their causes and stuff. But then the first part of the reading is more about what we can call a transparency advantage or a watchdog advantage, right? A watchdog is someone who monitors the government and calls them out when they're corrupt or when they're doing things poorly or badly or something like that, right? So the news media is usually considered a watchdog, but there's also things like whistleblowers and citizens who serve as watchdogs as well. And the idea here is that when government has eyes on them, when they're forced to be more transparent, that they'll be better actors. They'll behave better when they have that glare of people watching them. So mostly from the Schmidt and Cohen reading, they're saying that because of the internet and the access to information, There's more ability for citizens to investigate what's going on with their government and to fact check things, messaging maybe that their government or other like oligarchs or something like that share. Um, they also talk about the rise of citizen journalists, that now the media isn't just controlled by a few broadcast TV stations or a few major newspapers, but that we have all kinds of citizens out there doing research and doing journalism. And this gives us new perspectives on issues, and it also exposes us to new topics that oftentimes the mainstream media or the corporate media does not pay attention to. He uses the example of policing, and I think that's a good example these days with Black Lives Matter and such. You imagine, how much exposure we've had to police murdering and abusing people of color because everyone has camera phones and walks around and is able to videotape the police doing these things. The police have been doing these things for hundreds of years, and black people have been saying that for hundreds of years, but it was only really until we got video proof of it that Black Lives Matter really took off as a movement. Shirky and Schmidt and Cohen make the argument that it's harder to censor people and avoid transparency for governments, right? Because there are so many citizens out there participating and fact-checking, etc. Because this information can spread so quickly online, it's hard for the governments to censor and crack down on these things. They also say there's less opportunity for myth and misinformation, because the facts are out there as well, because the truth is circulating out there as well. They say there'll be more fact-checking and whatnot done by citizens, and makes it harder for myths and misinformation to spread. And they say that the access to all this information will promote critical thinking, will cause people to think about their government and think critically about politics and the world around them, as well as promote citizen participation, right? I think we've seen this somewhat with the rise in voting turnout, right? As well as the rise of activism over the past decade or so, right? Just more access to information about politics makes people more likely to get involved and get engaged in politics as well. They also have an important rebuttal response here, where they talk about confirmation bias. If you might remember the Hillis reading from our last debates about information overload, he talked about how information overload leads to confirmation bias. But Schmidt and Cohen say that actually, confirmation bias has always happened, and digital media actually makes it better because we're more likely to engage in confirmation bias. That is, look for information that we already agree with when we passively consume information. But with digital media, we're actively consuming information. We're making comments, we're retweeting, we're sharing, we're debating and discussing it, and therefore we're less likely to be engaged in confirmation bias. Just a few thoughts on rebuttals for these arguments, and these aren't an exhaustive list, and I hope that you can come up with some arguments of your own as well. First of all, you can use the Hillis arguments as well as some of the other articles we're reading about misinformation and disinformation and the problems of information overload to rebut some of this, right? Like the transparency and watchdog advantage especially. If there's more disinformation, then it's not more transparent, and governments aren't going to be more accountable. They're more able to manipulate people and their beliefs. And we've certainly seen that over the last 4 or 5 years. I think there's a good argument too that there's more transparency, but also more confusion. That is because there's so many conflicting views out there and so much different information out there. People aren't sure what to believe anymore, and then that sort of undermines the benefits of critical thinking and being a watchdog of your government because we're confused about what to believe. Also, the idea that transparency doesn't lead to change, right? We've had all of these videos of police shootings, and yet there hasn't been any major police reform take place, right? We also have known for a long time that our government is largely manipulated by wealthy billionaires and millionaires. But just because we know that and it's transparent doesn't mean that we've passed any campaign finance reform recently either. Right? So a lot of these advantages assume that transparency will lead to change, but maybe, historically that hasn't always been the case. You can use your slacktivism and distraction arguments as well against the public sphere advantage, right? That, yeah, sure, we discuss politics more, but we do so in sort of a distracted and, shallow manner. We'll also read some arguments about repressive governments and how they use social media to manipulate the public and digital media to watch over the public and survey them and target them and even lock them up or engage in rumor campaigns against them and stuff like that, which is a pretty good argument to the public sphere, right? Because the public sphere advantage assumes that the public sphere will promote democracy, but these arguments say, no, actually it's just as likely to reinforce repressive governments. And I think there's also a lack of empirical evidence for the public sphere. That is that, you can push the affirmative on where has digital media led to more democracy. Right now it seems like we're having a backsliding against democracy, both in the US and in Britain and other places, Turkey, Brazil, etc. So ask them, where is this great democratic kind of revival happening? Because it doesn't really seem to be happening historically right now. So those are just a few of the rebuttals that you can make. And again, you should be brainstorming those for our rebuttal day coming up in a few class periods. But hopefully you get the basics of these readings, and look forward to another video on Thursday. Have a good day.